How's it going, everybody? My name is Dave Whipple and you're watching Bush Radical. I see it time and time again. You watch off-grid content on television or on YouTube and people have brand new trucks and they have giant homesteads way out in the mountains. They're moving materials with helicopters. Man, you name it. I've seen the craziest stuff. So what are you supposed to actually believe? In this video, I want to show you guys what it was like for us when we were younger to get started living off-grid, why we did it, what our thoughts were, and what it actually looks like in real life. Stay tuned. Brooke and I got married in the fall of 1998. The following spring, we went to Sitka, Alaska, where we got a job as caretakers in Stargavin Campground. We both worked in town, but we lived in the campground. We took showers at the harbor, we did our laundry at the laundromat in town, and we got our water from an artesian well at the campsite. For a bathroom, we had the Forest Service outhouses. When we left Sitka, we ended up going to the Aleutian Islands for 7.5 months to be caretakers of this homestead. This place is called the Stonewall Place. It's named after a giant rock outcropping that's right in that area. Now, this homestead had electrical power, but it was generated from hydroelectric power. There was a small creek up the side of the mountain with a dam in it, and that dam was piped in a 4-inch PVC pipe down to a small generation house on the beach where there was a water wheel. So the pressurized water from the gravity would spin this water wheel and it would charge up the batteries. The place also had an inverter. So you actually had power, but it was limited to how much water came down the side of the hill. We had to watch the inverter, we had to top off the batteries, we had to keep an eye on maintaining the system for 7.5 months. And when the water got really low, when it was really cold, we ran out of electricity completely. Believe it or not, this homestead was heated with wood. We would go out and find drift logs that came from who knows where around the world, and we would hook onto these drift logs, pull them back to the homestead with a boat, and then cut them up, split them, and stack them. It's very windy and the wood dried out fairly quick. Now, the wood stove in this house wasn't really used to heat the house. It had a water jacket around it, and it was plumbed into a 500-gallon tank of water. You'd burn that stove hot for 5 hours, and it would heat up that 500-gallon tank. And for about a week, it would keep the house pretty decent. We did have a flush toilet because the entire water system of this house came off that creek. It was all pressurized because of gravity. Pretty interesting off-grid setup. We learned a lot that winter about off-grid systems. In the spring of 2000, we ended up back in Fairbanks, where we rented a small off-grid cabin. Then in the spring of 2001, we bought this 2-acre piece of property north of Fairbanks, Alaska. This is the first piece of raw land Brooke and I ever bought. You could see that somebody had already tried to do something with it. They'd had a pen, maybe a horse or two, who knows. Now, this property did have electricity, so technically it was not truly off-grid. But because of the frozen soil conditions, a conventional septic was out of the question. And water in this area is about 200 feet deep, and you're not guaranteed good water. So we were going to build a dry cabin, which means you haul your water. You have a 5-gallon bucket under your sink. When it fills up after washing dishes, you take the 5-gallon bucket outside and empty it. We also had a small vault. We started with a 55-gallon drum, which was for our outhouse. You couldn't really have just a pit type of an outhouse in this soil conditions because the ground was frozen. As soon as you dig a hole in the ground, it thaws out and then just turns into a mud bog. Definitely not what you want for an outhouse. Now, this cabin was 12 foot by 12 foot. It was built from all the logs that were already on the property. And even though this cabin wasn't 100% off-grid, it was partially off-grid. We also heated with wood, which is the only thing that makes sense in this type of an environment. You have a lot of fuel readily available. All you need to do is cut it, stick it in the stove, and burn it. Now, this property was about 10 miles outside of Fairbanks, so it was a short drive to get into town. Now, you can't do this 10 miles outside of most cities because it's completely unconventional. But in Fairbanks, you know, nobody batted an eye. Dry cabins just like this were pretty much the norm anywhere that there was questionable land. By the time we were done with this cabin, we had about $3,000 into the build. All the lumber in this cabin was rough cut, so it was all bought at a discount from a local mill. The roofing, the metal on the roof, the wood stove, all of those things we had to buy. Now, Fairbanks, Alaska has a waste management system where there's a sites called transfer sites. It's a parking lot with dumpsters all the way around the parking lot. The windows in this cabin all came from the dump, or the transfer site. So did the sink. So did the countertop. Whatever we could find for building materials that was useful, usable, and free, we picked it up and incorporated it into this cabin. We lived here for 2.5 years until our daughter was born in the spring of 2003. When I say 2.5 years, the three of us lived in this cabin until Christmas of that year. And the time between our daughter's birth and moving out of this cabin, we spent all that time building our second cabin. The 2.5 years we spent in this cabin were fantastic. It was a very free way of living and extremely affordable. But once it was more than just Brooke and myself, we needed a bigger place. So in the summer of 2003, we started building our second cabin. The idea was a 1,000 square foot cabin, 500 foot on the bottom, 500 foot on the upper story. And take a look at this foundation. It's concrete pads with little concrete piers on top. The idea is, if you're building on permafrost, you need to be able to adjust the foundation. If one area heaves, you can take a few shims off the top of the post. If it sinks, you can add a few. Now, we bought the logs for our second cabin. I think at that point in time it was about $2.50 a foot. You could bank on it being 2 or 3 times that today, because this was a while back. My brother Ryan came up that summer to help. My brother Ryan and I and our friend John Cassidy poured concrete all summer as a 3-man crew. And whenever we had downtime, we worked on this cabin, and I kept the guys busy. When we got to the second story, you can see we slid the logs up 2x4s, and then we would stage all of our logs on the second story floor. Now, this cabin had the same issues that the first cabin has. It was built on permafrost, so it needed a foundation that could be adjustable. That's why you see all those concrete piers. But this place did have electricity, just like the first cabin, but of course no running water, no indoor plumbing, so it's technically semi-off-grid. We lived in that cabin from Christmas of 2003 until August of 2006. By then, our son was born. We had bought a property in Delta Junction, Alaska, about 100 miles southeast of Fairbanks, and we decided to go down and build a homestead on that property. So in August of 2006, we set off on a completely new adventure, building a new homestead in a new place, and we sold these 2 cabins. Now, starting over was not a picnic, I'll tell you that. We lived in this little tiny camper until we built a garage. And then we kitted the garage out as a house and lived in the garage until we built a bigger cabin. But this area in Delta, it did have good water, and it wasn't that far down. So running water was actually going to be an option for the first time in years. This was about the time things went from being filmed to digital. And we don't have a ton of pictures of this garage. But we lived in this garage until we got our next house built. Let's talk about that. I started this log cabin build on our Delta property in the spring of 2008. All the time we were living in the garage, we hauled our water, and we had an outhouse that we used, and that was our complete plumbing and water system. We would get water from about 2 miles down the road at a public well. But this cabin was actually going to be a conventional home. It was going to have running water, electricity, and everything. Now, we lived on this property from 6 years, from 2006 to 2012. The shop/garage cost us about $20,000 to build, and the big house here cost about $50,000 to build. But we had the cash on hand, and it was totally doable because we started small with a 12x12 cabin back in Fairbanks. We built as we could afford it. We put money into materials. We had 100% equity from day one, and that made all the difference. That's why we could have a place like this without going into debt. In 2012, we sold that property and we bought an old farmstead in northern Michigan. We could pay cash for this because, of course, we had 100% equity in the previous property. Now, the old farm has running water and indoor plumbing, so this is kind of the tail end of our first chapter of off-grid living. But that didn't last very long. Let me tell you about 2014. In 2014, our friend Neil Eklund got a television show with the National Geographic Channel, building log rafts and floating them down the Yukon River. Brooke and I had known Neil for 14 years, and she had worked on a previous log raft that Neil had built back in 2000. He invited us to come on the show, and we were all going to build rafts and float down the Yukon. Fantastic adventure. We had a marvelous time. I can't say enough good stuff about Neil, his son Laro, the film crew. The whole process was fantastic. I loved every minute of it. But it was right back to off-grid living. We did have a generator that we would charge camera batteries with. The camera crews would run that a couple hours every other day to get all their batteries charged up. At the end of the raft, we had a small portable toilet with a 5-gallon bucket. Inside the 5-gallon bucket were heavy-duty, emphasis on heavy-duty, biodegradable bags. And that's what we would use for a toilet. When the bucket was full, we would beach the raft, go up into the woods and bury the contents of the bucket with the bag. We would also stop at all the freshwater creeks to fill up our water supply. Some of it got filtered, some of it didn't. It all depended on the creek and where we were at. This is wild country, so it's not likely to be polluted by people, but it could always have giardia. Wonderful off-grid experience. The following summer, we bought 4 acres north of Fairbanks, Alaska, and started another homestead. This homestead was going to be completely off-grid, 100%. No running water, no indoor plumbing. The idea was we still had a lot of business in Alaska, we had a lot of friends in Alaska, and we wanted a small homestead where we could spend 4 or 5 months in Alaska in the summer and then the rest of the year in northern Michigan. The first year we lived in a wall tent. The second year we lived in a wall tent while we built the foundation of the cabin. Now 2016 was a big year for us. Brooke started her YouTube channel in March, and we also had applied to be on the Alone program on the History Channel. By that fall, we'd been chosen to be finalists in Season 4, and I'm sure that our off-grid background had a lot to do with getting picked. Brooke already had a YouTube channel that she was getting off the ground, and this 49 days of camera experience kind of got me over the mental hump to get started on my own channel. I'd had the thought of doing a channel for a couple years at this point, but I was intimidated by camera work. I shouldn't have been. It's quite easy. The next summer back in Fairbanks, we started putting up logs, and now you see it's video. Every log that went into this log cabin came off this property. Everyone was cut by hand. Everyone was milled by hand. Every log was carried from where the tree fell and was milled to where it ended up in the wall. It took a long time. I wouldn't really recommend this unless you have nothing but time. During the days and the week, I was doing concrete work in Fairbanks, which was about a 25-minute drive. And in the evenings and weekends, I would work on this cabin. Because we had 2 kids in school, I would generally come up at the end of April, about a month earlier than Brooke and the kids, and get to work. And then when the kids and Brooke left in the fall for school, I would generally stay on about an extra month and get as much done on this place as I could while finishing up the concrete season in town. Now, Brooke started doing YouTube in 2016, and I started doing YouTube in 2017. So you see we've switched from photographs to video by this point. This was the first real project I took on after starting the YouTube channel. Now, this property is on a steep hillside, and the ground has fairly good drainage, so just a standard old-school outhouse is what we chose to go with here. We also get enough sunshine that solar is definitely an option, so that was part of the plan from the beginning. We hauled our water from a public well that's on our way to town, so we never made any special trips for water. We would generally just get water on our way in or our way out whenever we went to the store or into work. It was quite convenient as hauling water can be. All the dimensional lumber in this project was rough cut, and it came from local mills in the area. I will say this though, as much as I like to use rough cut just because it's a full 2 inches by a full whatever, and it's stronger by nature, it is getting more expensive, at least in this part of the world. It used to be you could save quite a lot of money by using rough cut lumber in this area, but it doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. It is stronger, so I do like that, but there's really no savings nowadays. Now, by now, you're probably seeing a pattern. Brooke and I have always building equity into a property. We've always bought materials and did the work ourselves. We hire nothing out if we can help it. And that helps us to build value in the property, ownership, right from day one. We never take out a loan for anything. If we don't know how to do a certain aspect of the construction process, we learn how to do it. That's one piece of advice that I think is the most important. That's the key. If you're interested in off-grid living, if that idea appeals to you, ask yourself this simple question. Are you willing to learn? Do you love to learn? If you're open to trying and learning all the skills that you need for building, for the plumbing that is involved even in an off-grid house, for electrical, hooking up gas lines, working on your own stuff, if you're willing to learn and get your hands dirty and not have to hire stuff done, then I think it's a fantastic way to get ahead in life, especially for young people, to get a really good start and have ownership from day one. When Brooke and I built our first cabin in 2001, we basically had three options. We could apply for a loan and buy a house and have a 30-year mortgage. We could rent a house, which even a dry cabin at that time was about $500 a month. Or we could buy a cheap piece of land and we can build. And from day one, we would have ownership of that property. We would have ownership of that house. Our very first piece of property we bought from Robert Fox at Fox Realty in Fairbanks, Alaska. We paid $6,500 for 2 acres of permafrost land. We put $1,000 down, and the rest of it we owed to Robert Fox in a note. We paid that note off that summer. We put every dime we could afford into paying it off, and we've never borrowed another dollar for housing since then. There's a lot to think about right there. This property took us years to finish. Years. Because we built as we went. We were building in a way that was very time consuming and very physical, but very cheap. And we were only there part of the year to start with. Once we had the cabin done, we really needed to focus in on the other systems that you need, no matter where you live, whether you're on-grid or whether you're off-grid. We got this bathtub from the dump and built this small shower house. Cost about $800 to build this little building. Speaking of shower houses, that just brings me back to the point. There are systems that everybody needs no matter where you live. You need a way to get cleaned up. You need a little bit of power to run anything that you happen to have that's electric. You can take care of that in a lot of ways. Solar panels and batteries. You can have a small generator. At this place, we tend to use the generator more than anything else. The reason is, we don't need much for lighting. Being that this is Alaska, and we're just here in the summer, it's daylight most of the time. So lighting is not our first concern. But it can get really hot in interior Alaska in the summertime, so a place to take a shower is pretty important. Now, I got this piece of linoleum from the dump. So that's a good way to cut costs whenever you can. I found it a couple years ago, and it's been sitting in the yard just waiting for something to be installed in. But I had it when I needed it, and I didn't pay anything for it. Do I know how to install vinyl? Well, not really. I just figured it out as I went, like everything else. Which just brings me back to that piece of advice, the best piece of advice you could get. Just be ready to try anything. Be ready to give it a shot. Most things are easier than you think they are. But the idea that you have to hire a professional to do, well, pretty much anything, you know, that keeps a lot of people from trying this kind of a lifestyle. I would also say that a lot of the content on YouTube, the off-grid living content, is very confusing. You see stuff like this where somebody's catching rainwater off the roof of a shed, but then you also see a place that has $40,000 worth of solar panels, or they have a brand new $50,000 tractor, or they're going to move building material with a helicopter. I saw that one time on television. Who the heck has a helicopter? That's so unrealistic. I don't even know how to relate to that. That's one of the reasons I decided to make this video. Off-grid living, what I understand it to be, what it's been through my life before YouTube, almost before the internet, has very little to do with a lot of the content that I see on YouTube. I think there is a Hollywood version of off-grid living, and then there is an actual version of off-grid living. And I don't know that the two of them have a whole lot in common. Brooke and I started down this path 20 years ago. And it was the best option for us at the time because it was a way that two young people could have a roof over their head for next to nothing, so long as they were willing to sweat and work and learn. And that made sense to us. But nowadays, you know, there is a hipster version of off-grid living too that is completely a fantasy land, in my opinion. Let's be honest here too, so many people have jumped on the off-grid bandwagon because it's popular on YouTube. YouTube is an income stream, and a lot of people have decided to do off-grid content because they find it inspiring. They like the idea, but there's also a financial element there too. There is an opportunity to make money on YouTube with off-grid content. And of course, I think it's pretty easy for people to tell the difference between an authentic experience and some hipster version of off-grid living. For me, YouTube has really been a blessing because it allows me to do what I've always done and share it with the world. I personally feel much more at home with an outhouse and a wood stove in a little cabin than I would a furnace and a nice bathroom in a beautiful, expensive home, especially when you have a mortgage on it. For Brooke and I, the income from YouTube has allowed us to buy some property that is much more remote, which is what we both would prefer, not being tied to a certain area to make a living. But that's certainly not the way we started. We started way before YouTube. We had hard jobs, physical jobs in town. We would come home and haul water from the well, take showers at the truck stop. That was the reality of things way back in the day, how we got started and why we got started living off-grid. It made a lot of sense back then. It was a way to get ahead. So if you feel overwhelmed by some of the stuff you see on off-grid content, people with a lot of money, people who have massive solar panel systems, people who have a lot of acreage in beautiful places, they're running livestock, they have brand new vehicles, and you think, what in the world is real? How do these people pay their bills? How do they afford groceries? How can they have all this stuff if what they are is really remote? Well, the chances are they're not really remote. The chances are it's not what it looks like. There are people out there that are probably making all their money off really popular YouTube content. And that's why I wanted to make this video. I wanted to make this video for people who don't understand what they're seeing portrayed on YouTube in the off-grid space. The truth is, for me, I got out of school and I started right into building trades. I started doing concrete for $6 an hour, and I learned a lot about carpentry in that trade. And after Brooke and I got married and we decided we wanted to have a house, you know, it was just a decision to build one rather than to buy one. And it was a decision to do it really affordably so we didn't end up in debt. And in Fairbanks, Alaska, where we were at the time, the cabin thing was it was quite the norm. Dry cabins were the example that you looked at, and it's like, well, we could do that. So if you've ever wondered how we got here, what our journey looked like, what we were actually doing 20 years ago, and how we ended up on YouTube, well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video and got some insight as to what the truth is when it comes to the off-grid content you see on YouTube. We've always been building cabins, and it's nice to have a cabin in a remote place. It just so happens it's also something a lot of people want to watch, so it's a fantastic fit, in my opinion, for Brooke and I. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of YouTube content out there that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. So keep your eyes open. Don't believe everything that you see. If you find a channel you really like, ask them to tell you how they got there. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Dave Whipple, and you've been watching Bush Radical. And be radical, eh? See you soon.